My name is Sean Harrington. As I said before, welcome to Best Buy. If there's anything I can help you with. I am dressed as somebody from Mattel Electronics circa 1986 in a world that never happened because of the computer crash. So this is a brief journey through the history, death, rebirth of the coolest little 8-bit system that you probably never heard about, definitely don't care about. My goals today are that you will maybe give the Aquarius a try. You don't have to have real hardware to do that. Maybe take a step further, do something cool on the Aquarius. Maybe join an Aquarius community. There's a couple of them out there. And then, if nothing else, tell somebody else at the fair today about this, again, cool little orphaned system. So a little bit about me. I work for the Ventura County Fire Department. I am not a firefighter, as you can tell by my very slim physique. I manage about 5 people. We develop iOS applications for our firefighters and our public safety folks. In the evenings, I work for California Lutheran University in their MSIT program. I teach very needy graduate students. I've got my bachelor's in computer science and master's in computer science. Those are becoming harder to find these days. In fact, Cal Lutheran got rid of their computer science master's degree. So I also spent some time at Cal Arts. That's where I met my wife. Some of the technical things I've done. I work with Perry Fractic on the VIC-2 squared switcher. Of course, that's now completely obsolete because of some of the great achievements that we've had in FPGAs for the VIC-2. I also rebuilt a 1975 Ramtech horoscope machine, not even a video game, but it's in the full-size cabinet. It used bleeding-edge technology, a 7-pin dot matrix printer, and you could use all these dials. I reprogrammed it in an Arduino Mega. Actually, I had to use 2 of them. What else? I've done a lot of work on the Aquarius. I have reverse engineered the motherboard for the Aquarius, and it only ever had one motherboard, which is nice. So of course I put that on JLC PCB and PCBWay so people can order them if they want to. I also did the mini expander. The mini expander was bundled in with the Aquarius, but a lot of people in the UK and in Europe don't have access to that, so you can also get a mini expander. It adds a sound chip and control ports. I also did a composite mod for the Aquarius, and then an RGB to HDMI, which is a derivative of the Hoglet 76 that kind of makes its way around. I also worked on the Aquarius MX, which is an expansion of the mini expander, and then a new product, the Aquarius Plus, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the history of electronics, particularly in toys. We've had electric toys for a long time, well back into the 30s. Erector sets had motors with them a lot. You had little batteries and motors that could make buzzing sounds. And after World War II, when you had a lot of kids being born from GIs and families moving to the suburbs, a company called Mattel, named after its founders Matthew and Elliot, Mattel, got really good at this new process of injection molded plastic. And in fact, that's probably one of the hallmarks of what made Mattel so great, is they got really good at plastic really quickly. But in the 70s, kids were getting tired of electric toys. They wanted to move into electronics. So, how many had one of these when you were growing up? I'd say it's probably one of the most important handheld devices that existed. If this didn't exist, then we probably wouldn't have Game Boys or anything like that. This is mine. It's very dusty, as you can see. But this is not what changed it. What actually changed it was this device. This was the first Mattel Electronics handheld game. And it came about because George Close was looking at a bunch of these calculator parts that were hanging around. Calculators and LED displays became ubiquitous in the early 70s. Any engineer with half of its salt had traded in his slide rule for some sort of a digital calculator. So he was trying to figure out a use for this, and for those of you who know how LED displays work, they've got the top row, the middle row, and the bottom row, and then a bunch of verticals, so you can make a perfect figure eight out of about 7 digits. So he said, well, what if we turned this sideways and then made these race cars that you had to move around? And of course, the way you make LEDs work is you don't keep the voltage on all the time, you pulse them, use pulse width modulation. So we'll add a little more pulses here to make this car, our car, brighter than the others, and we'll maybe put some obstructions in there. So the folks at Mattel said, this is great. What can you get your cost down to? And I think the cost for unit was probably landed with stickers and in plastic, probably no more than, I'd say maybe $2. And that sounded great because they could sell this device for about $20. The football game and many of the others that came after it, the target price was, I think, $30, $25, depending on where you got them. And of course, they had basketball and hockey and even some non-sports games as well, too. But Mattel said, hey, let's start a whole division for this, and let's see what we can do. We kind of like what Atari is doing. Let's partner with this company that's made a lot of other electronics. They make RF modulators and other things, Radifin. It's a UK company based out of Hong Kong. They really know this stuff. Let's partner with them and see if we can do something interesting. So they did. About 1977, 78, the Atari VCS comes out and rocks the world, primarily because, although it's not the first, it is certainly the best marketed cartridge-based home video entertainment system. Mattel Electronics says, we can do that. We've got this great partner in Radifin. Let's sell an intelligent television, also known as the Intellivision. I believe it came on the market in '79. People were super excited about it, but one thing that Mattel did that was a differentiator, but also wound up being a thorn in its side, was the keyboard attachment. They sold the Intellivision on these ads saying, hey, yeah, we know you could buy an Atari, but this can also turn into a computer. That's all great and good, but around 81, 82, after the Intellivision had been on the market, a lot of those same customers were saying, hey, where's that computer unit you were promising us? So the Federal Trade Commission started investigating Mattel about where this was. So they scrambled. They said, hey, what are we going to do? Well, let's finish up this thing, but it's not a full computer system. We want to develop a computer system that is still cartridge-based, that can make us some money on the return investment, sell the blades, not the handle. So they came up with the Aquarius. So in June of 1983, June 5th, at the Consumer Electronics Show, Mattel Electronics brought out the Aquarius. To much ballyhoo. So what did it look like? This is it. You can tell right away one of its major flaws, and that's these ridiculous chiclet keys. Cost-saving feature. Let's do a little bit of a breakdown here. So this is what it looks like under the hood. It's got its little chiclet key pad here. It's got a cartridge port, because of course we want to sell cartridges. It had a Z80. It had a couple of PLAs. Those are the only two real bespoke chips in the thing. Those are the ones that are hard to find. It did use a couple of other chips. It had a TEA 1002, which was very common in a lot of the video game systems at the time. It did have 4K of memory on it, actual RAM. It did have a sys-ROM here that's typical 8K. What else did it have? Let me get this out of the way. So how did the market take to this? Now let's look at these specifications. Not super amount of speed, 4K. Half of it was taken up by video RAM, as is typical. It did have an expansion bus where you can add both ROMs and RAM. What else? Oh, of course it used RF out. It's easy. That was a state of the art at the time. Had that disgusting chiclet-style keyboard with 50 rubber keys. Had a printer and data recorder ports. Again, a couple of special chips there. And it was good. The problem was it had a hardwired power supply in it. So you had this boat anchor hanging around the back of this device. So what else did it offer? Well, they did have several components that they were offering, not necessarily at launch. Some of them came a little bit later, but most of these were available within the first 3 months. So Mattel and Radifin had their stuff together on this. The things that never really shipped or never really materialized were this Q disc. There are prototypes out there. It uses an odd size 3.5-inch floppy, not your traditional ones that we used later on. And there was also the Aquarius 2. It had a mechanical keyboard, which is kind of cool, and it did have an additional 4K ROM in it for extended basics. So if you wanted to do some of the drawing routines, you had that. Architecturally, those are the only two differences between the Aquarius and the Aquarius 2. People say, oh, no, it had a programmable character generator, it had RGB out. None of that is true. All right, so what else do we got? Well, it was panned by the critics. It was deemed as a computer for the 1970s, which is true. If you look at those specs, It was a lot like the TI-99, the Sinclair, a lot of those ones that came out around 1979, 1980. So what do we think happened? Yep, lasted on the market for about 4 months. By the end of 1983, early 1984, there were other things happening in the computer industry. And so me, ever the bastion of expert timing, I decided now's a great time to buy an Aquarius. But a little bit of background. Single mother with my sister and I, so we had a limited income. I couldn't afford a TRS-80 or an Apple or anything. I taught myself programming like many of you did, taking computer books out, but I typed my code on an electric typewriter, set it in a drawer until I actually had one. Saved my holiday and birthday cash. My Valentine's Day is my birthday, so that makes me an Aquarius. So I'm walking by KB Toys on my way to the Spring South 6 theaters in Kansas City, Kansas, and I see this great bundle. That's what KB Toys did. They put the good stuff out front, super cheap. That's how I also got my entire Intellivision system. 99 bucks. I happen to have 99 bucks. So now I began programming on my own real computer. So that lasted a little bit. Moore's Law for the win. And within 2 years, I was no longer using an Aquarius. So remember, I started out with a typewriter. Then I got rid of the Aquarius about 86. I actually stopped using it in 85. And then I was the C64 guy in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I know, not a huge pond there, but I did have a BBS, the high-tech BBS. I had 2 Rockin 1541 drives, one of those high-density drives, and a 1200 baud modem. I was getting the European wares and the European demos, and I loved it. But like anything else, that was not sustainable. If I wanted to do real work, if I wanted to do the design work that I was used to, I moved on to Mac in 87, Windows in 1999, because I was tired of waiting 2 years for software to come out for the Mac. And then also for me, I did get a PowerMac 8550, and I got that through the Apple Developer Program, because at that time, Apple Developer Program lets you get heavily discounted hardware. But Steve Jobs came back, and it's good that he did for Apple, but it wasn't so great for the developer program, so he shut that down. So I figured XP is good enough, it's time to jump ship. So that's what I've been doing for a bit. Oh, with a little bit of Linux tossed in here and there. I had a couple of rack servers because I was doing domain hosting. I actually owned the domain macgenius.com. A certain large company bought that from me probably around 2005, so it was a good investment. All right, what else? So let's do a post-mortem on the Aquarius. So the legend is that the Aquarius caused a $394 million loss that nearly bankrupted Mattel. The legend is that Redifin was forced to buy that stock back, and that Redifin then subsequently drove the platform into obscurity, and that the Aquarius brand is still the property of Intellivision Incorporated. Well, some of that's mostly true. First of all, Aquarius was only a minor contributing factor. There was obviously the larger video game crash of 83, 84 that was the major factor. That being said, Mattel Electronics didn't exist as a subdivision after 1984. They closed it up, absorbed it back into Mattel. While Mattel did force Redifin to take it, there was already a clause that said, hey, we're gonna give you money and you get all of this stock, you take this off of our hands. So they weren't really forced, it was part of the contract anyway. And Redifin actually did okay. They recuperated their money. They sold it. If you were buying any timeshares after 1987, go out and see a timeshare property and you were given a free computer, it was probably an Aquarius, probably one of the bundles that I bought for 99 bucks. And the Redifin trademark was actually abandoned in 1990. So here's from the US Trademark Office, and there it is. It was abandoned. So anybody can use the Aquarius trademark if they want to. So here we are with a oh-so-realistic 3D generated wasteland. And it looks like a PS1 cutscene. And there's the Aquarius out in the desert. So what am I gonna do? 10 years later, or to use a SpongeBob, 10 years later. This was 17 years after launch. Why did the Aquarius still suck? Nothing had happened. Most of them were sitting in people's garages, closets. What were the issues? Well, it had limited RAM, not much software. There's only about 12 release cartridges that are out there. It still used cassette storage. It was still RF out. So a lot of problems. So here's the effects of that. This is why people had no interest in maybe turning it on other than once or twice, if they were lucky. And again, with no SDK, yes, you could do assembly. It's a Z80 processor, so there's plenty of SDKs out there for that. But really, no serious developers were gonna take this on. Then came along the whole concept of emulators. MAME hit really big in the late 90s, and along with that, we got a tool called Virtual Aquarius, which is a pretty neat little tool. It took some of the MAME libraries, particularly for the AY38910 sound chip, and it made it so you could actually run this you could play with your Aquarius ROMs. It developed the CAC file format, which stands for Cassette Aquarius, which takes the bit stream from the Aquarius and allows you to load them in. It's not quite like a ROM. It actually has a basic loader that kicks off a call to the machine code. It also allowed you to switch the sys-ROMs. Now, there was only two of them. There was an S1 sys-ROM and an S2. But since there was no programmable character set here, the only way you could swap out the fonts if you wanted something that looked more like, the code page 850 font or something like that, you would have to change that ROM within the program. But it did do something interesting, and this is a boon to developers. It allowed you to stream in a text file as long as it was had line numbers and it was basic. So you could stream in data from the text stream, just pointing to a text file, and it would load in. It's like you're typing it really, really fast. Then you could use the virtual save to C-load out to a file if you wanted to do that, to the CAC format. But we're still in a wasteland. This is the early 2000s, not much going on. So here's a little lonely Aquarius. 16 years later, we're now 32 years after launch. Not much has happened. All we have is an emulator, and a lot more Aquariuses gathering dust. eBay starts to hit. eBay's been around for a long time, but we see a lot of Aquariuses starting to sell on that, more like in the $50 price range. 2016, things changed a lot. So one of my buddies, Jay Snellen, he created an Aquarius cart called the AquariCart, very uniquely named. He took all of the custom ROMs that were there, along with some demo ROMs, put them in one thing, used bank switching, so that anybody who had an Aquarius could have one cartridge to rule them all. While there were 4K and 16K RAM cartridges available at launch from Mattel, he also released a 32K memory cartridge, which was great. If anybody had the mini expander, it has a slot for RAM and a slot for a ROM. So that was neat. Other things started to happen too. Bruce Abbott, a gentleman from New Zealand, developed what he calls the micro expander. Now this is cool because it does have the sound chip. Of course, the Z80 itself can do chip tunes, single voice, but the AY sound chip is a legitimate programmable sound generator. And it has 3 voices, but it also has inputs, which is what the mini expander had. But again, a lot of the folks from the UK and Europe couldn't get those mini expanders. They also couldn't get the controllers. So he broke it out. Rather than having 2 DB9s, he did this 2x10 expansion port that you could break out into headers for that. But this is the game changer. He used an CH376 module, which is very common for Arduino users. It gives you a full data bus, and it gives you control pins so you can actually save stuff out. On the bottom of the board under here, there is a ROM, so it behaves like a real cartridge, but it gives you some extended basic commands. It gives you a revised clear screen command, which I don't know why it didn't have originally, but you have just a regular save and load command. So now you can actually chain programs together. You're not limited by that 32K. It loads in sub-second speed, so you're not waiting for this serial tape to play through. And if you were interested in that, here's where he's at. It also gave you a traditional audio jack, whereas the original RF modulator, you had to do some magic to make that happen. So here I am. I'm now 30 years older. I have disposable income because I've decided to sell my soul. My family's grown, so that means I have a lot of leisure time. I'm also a bit introspective about technology. I remember when I first cracked open my Aquarius in 84, 85, the RF shield scared the crap out of me. Oh, this has got some weird radiation in it. And I'd played with soldering irons and stuff like that before, but I really was nervous about cracking that open. I didn't want to, it was only 99 bucks, but that was a lot of money for me at the time. But I'd spent a lot of time working at Showbiz Pizza, working in the back of video games with 10,000 volt CRTs. So I was a bit more introspective. I kind of knew what parts dealt with. I'd also worked with people like Perry Fractic on that VIC-2 switcher and some other things, so I was more comfortable with microelectronics. And I had a lot of guilt. I felt guilty about getting rid of that little little Aquarius 30 years earlier. So our Aquarius comes a little bit closer out of the desert. Okay, Mr. Harrington, you're up. What are you going to do? So the first thing I did was I created the composite AV adapter. I don't like it when people hack plastic, particularly because since the Aquarius was from Mattel, the plastics are really good. They're really well fitting. Again, Mattel knows their injection molded plastic. So I wanted to make sure that anything that I made would use the existing ports. So this fits in the exact footprint of the RF modulator. You have to get heavy-duty soldering iron because it's soldered into the ground plane, but it also attaches to where the ground plane was. It uses the sound input and the video input. The good part about it is this is scan frequency independent, so this works on NTSC or PAL. I decided to use a TRRS 1/8" jack to deliver the audio left, audio right, and the video out. And most importantly, I made it so that it's through hole. So average folk can actually solder this thing without having to be an expert in tweezers and micro soldering. And about this time, we got a new Microsoft-based emulator. Richard Chandler, who's out of the UK, has been developing Aqualight for 24, 25 years now. It started off as a hobby. It's still technically a hobby, but he is actively supporting it. It also supports that micro expander. So you can run this software as though you have one of those MX expanders in it too. As I said before, I also reverse engineered the PCBs so that anybody could do it. So you're not hacking up this original stuff, which I kind of consider an artifact. But if people want to make modifications to this, they absolutely can. I had one person put the power pins here. I've seen all of the power filtering stuff pulled off, which is great. I've seen people create, this is kind of an odd size because it's a shadow mask type of a ROM. If you want to use an EEPROM, you have to have some sort of an adapter. I've seen people build those on there. And of course, I also did the mini expander PCB so that anybody can go to PCBWay and buy one of those. About this time, people started developing new software for the Aquarius. Roy Templeman, also out of the UK, started releasing a couple of familiar-looking games. We see a lot of those. He developed a worm game, kind of a bomb catcher, a alien dropping bombs on the White House type of a game. And he's one of the few people I know that actually owns an Aquarius 2. So he developed a version of bomb catcher for the Aquarius 2. He likes his cassettes. Full disclosure, I hate cassettes. They take forever to load. They're charming the first time you do it. Then after you wait 8 minutes to load a 2K file, it gets really old. So I'm all for USB and random access media. But you can buy the ROMs of these. You don't have to have a cassette with it. What else? Now this was big. So if you are doing development on the Aquarius, since it's a character-based system, there was never any real tool for prototyping screens. So Matt Pills, back in 2020, developed a web-based app called Aquarius Draw that allows you to use this crazy wonky character set that's actually pretty flexible, all things considered, and allows you to set the background and foreground colors. Again, this is pretty familiar, 16 color palette, well, 8-bit color palette with dark versions of each of those. And you can do some interesting stuff. Of course, you can save it as a PNG or a JPEG, but it also will put out assembly code in either TASM or ZMAC format. It'll put it out in BASIC, so you've got a bunch of data statements at the bottom. But we also developed a new format that is just a raw 2K of screen RAM. So you just load it up at the beginning of character RAM, and it floods all the way through the color RAM in that upper 1K. So this allows us to do stuff that actually looks decent for a character-based system. So bring in the heavy guns. So Mac Wharton came out with an RGB for multi-sync monitors. It's best for CRTs, particularly if they are SCART-based CRTs. There's still a few of those hanging around in the UK. As I said before, I modified the Hoglet 67 and E&B bare metal Raspi implementation. It takes the RGB and then intensity signals in, digitizes them, and sends them out the Raspberry Pi's micro port. That was great until about 2 years ago because you couldn't get those to save your life. So that's one of the reasons why I've never really sold this much. There's also some tweaking. There's a lot of phase shifting that you have to do to get some of the pixels to line up just right, otherwise they drift. But it is still probably the best picture quality for panel displays on the Aquarius. I also got rid of that stupid chiclet keyboard, designed my own mechanical keyboard. So this is effectively an Aquarius 2 because I do have a ROM switcher here that will put that extended BASIC into the 4K hole above the sysROM. Notice also that I'm not tethered by that power brick anymore. I put a little Meanwheel power supply, took all the power conditioning stuff off. So this runs at a clean switched 5, 12, and minus 12 volts. And people say, why don't you make this for sale? I'm not in the fulfillment business. People would not pay this. If you've ever tried to design a mechanical keyboard, you have two PCBs. One is to just hold the Cherry MX switches in place, and then the bottom one is actually the soldering layer. So that's two PCBs that are bigger than normal. Most people don't want to buy that. Plus, switches are anywhere from 50 cents to $1 a piece. For 50 keys, that's more than most people want to pay. They want a little, $25, $30 USB keyboard. But there are many mods. We had our first new cartridge-based game in 2022 by William Hicks, 8-Bit Millie. He did the full packaging thing. He did a good job. It plays kind of like a similar game that came out on the, I think it was either the Coleco or the Speccy, one of those two. Plays okay. This was out of left field. Inafuto, if anybody has seen the Inafuto games, it is a cross-system game compiler. It compiles to about 20 different systems. He has an SDK, but it's in Japanese. I can't get a good translation for it. It's kind of like a modified C, but we were able to gather up the 12 games that he had at this time and then create bootloaders for the Aquarius. Plays really well, and we were just lucky that he happened to choose the Aquarius as a target for it. All right, what about that terrible disk-based controller? Well, Ricky L. Kasem just recently released this AquaPad. It uses an Arduino in it with a battery pack. Plays pretty well. He uses an analog stick. The Aquarius control pad actually does 16 directions. And the problem is that the 16 directions aren't chords of one another. So if you do northeast, this is not a combination of these two bits. That's actually here. So it's a little weird the way Mattel implemented it. So you have to do a little bit of translation. He covers that really well. I don't know, it's about a 30-pound cartridge or a 30-pound shipment from the UK. He's also done some others. He's got a digital tape drive that you can use so you don't have to find the old cassette player. So this was, for me, a pretty big achievement. So I took the the micro expander that Bruce Abbott had developed, again, 2016, and I took a look at the things that weren't working for me. It was a combination of surface mount stuff. It's 3 boards plus an additional board. You didn't know which one you needed depending on the CH376 unit you got, and sometimes if you ordered one, you actually got the other one. It was difficult for most end users to make. It was a triumph, but it wasn't easy for them to make. So we took all of that, put it in a shell that was basically the same size as the mini expander. You can print it yourself on most 8x8 3D printers. Again, PCB is easy to order. It's free. I don't sell these. people in other countries sell them, so they don't have to pay import taxes. It does all of the things that the micro expander does, but we do have an optional additional sound chip, so you can have up to 6 voices, and we've just recently added a real-time clock in it in place of the RAM, because it just happens to fit in the same space. So it's pretty cool. So now, back in June, we were at 40 years after launch. So where do we go from here? Well, let's look at that list of suckiness so far. Here's our issues. And what have we done to make those less sucky? Well, first, about the RAM. Well, we do have that 32K RAM expansion. Both the micro expander and the MX also have 32K of RAM on it. I think we could do better. There's always banking. But what about that software library? Well, again, as we saw, we've got some new cassette titles. We've got the Aquarius, but we've got this new MX Basic that we've developed that extends the basic command set. It includes a lot of the extended basic circle, draw, square, a lot of those routines. Pretty exciting. How do we deal with cassette storage other than just throw it out the window? Well, we can use this USB on the micro or the MX, or again, Ricky's Aquatape or Aquamax takes the old cassettes out of the equation. And cassettes suffer from a couple of issues. Obviously, the media can fade, but those old drives have belts that go out. They have a couple of electrolytic capacitors that are important for the voltage level that's coming through the volume on that tape to make sure it's the same. If you get one with old electrolytic caps in it and you put one tape in it, it'll be barely audible. You put fresh ones in, it's like magic. What about the RF output? Well, we talked about composite AV and the RGB mods. Character-based graphics, there's not a lot we can do without doing some serious brain surgery on the Aquarius. So for now, we use a good tool that allows us to draw some fun stuff on the Aquarius, and Aquarius Draw definitely does that. The chiclet keyboard, well, again, I did develop a mechanical keyboard case. It's not necessarily cost-effective for most people to do that. Scattered documentation, well, that is true, but with the internet, with a lot of these groups, and to tell you the truth, Martin van der Steenhoven has been kind of one of the hallmarks of keeping all of the Aquarius information these years, back in the dark era, before the Empire. But Facebook groups and a lot of GitHubs now will document this stuff so you can figure out how this hardware actually works. And again, we've got some new basic for the original Aquarius that we can deal with. We also have developed some tool paths for using SDCC to compile. Certainly the Z80 developers that are out there, there's lots of environments for that. All right, so how close are we? Oh my gosh, he's very close. Okay, so the Aquarius has arrived. We're now 40 years after launch. Who's going to carry on the legacy? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this extended Aquarius MX Basic. This started out as just a way to add a real-time clock to the Aquarius MX. I just wanted to have a time so we could actually write the real file date when we were writing files to the USB stick. But there's also some time elements that you can do. We decided to use a Dallas RTC, very user-friendly. It's a phantom clock, so you have to go through a series of machine code calls to the memory space that it's using. Then it unlocks it, and there's a stream of about 64 bits that can be used to either read the or write the time and date. It's time and date both. So Curtis and Mac took a look at that. They solved the RTC thing really quickly. We were all set to do a USB Basic 1.3 within about a month. But one of the things that's in the original USB Basic is a really big debugger and a really useful but not really PT3 music player. It was baked into the ROMs. It's great that it's there, but that took up easily 3/4 of the 16K that the cartridge can use. So Curtis said, what? I'd kind of like to, first of all, I'd like to fix the arctangent function. I'm like, who uses arctangent? And he goes, I do. I'm like, okay. So he goes, I want to fix the arctangent function. I'm like, okay, great. That's going to be what? It's, 80 bytes or so. And he fixed it. And he goes, I think I can update the clear screen function, because it would be great if we could clear screen to a different paper versus ink. I'm like, oh, okay, great, do that. But then the ball started rolling. He's like, there's a lot of stuff in Extended Basic we could put in here if we get rid of this stupid debugger. And the only person in the group who was super interested in it was Mac. Mac loves his debugger. They're great. But when you're running in an emulator, that's much easier to do debugging work. You don't necessarily need it on the hardware. We have a way to do it. We UDF hook to it, but you don't need it baked into the ROM. And then it was just this flow. He started, the most important thing, he reworked the number handler. As in many systems, you use signed integers. Signed integers are the bane of anybody who is learning computer programming on 8-bit systems, because anything above 32K, you got to think in reverse, negative integers. So he reworked it so it'll take anything within the negative integer space, so any code that's written for that will work, but it also goes up to the full 32,768, or sorry, the 65,535 space as well too. And he goes, I can fix that one more, so we're gonna handle all hexadecimal numbers. Along with that, we have hexadecimal to decimal integer converter numbers, or conversion functions. And we added about 30 brand new commands from Extended Basic and others. We extended poke so that it's not just a pair of numbers. It's a range of numbers. You can have a step function. You can have pairs of numbers that will do all of that sequentially. He introduced deke and doke, which does doubles. Super useful if you're doing memory addresses and other things that require 2 bytes anyway. It's not a 2-step process with a poke. It's just a simple deke or a doke. Lots of others. This is now, we're finishing our second beta. It's rock solid. The only person who's finding bugs is Curtis. So that's fun. And then what's next? So this is really kind of our pride and joy. For those of you who have been following the Commander X16 project, this may sound familiar. Frank developed the Vera video chip for the Commander X16. In the dark period of time, for the past couple of years when nobody was able to get silicon chips, certainly not FPGAs, but even simple stuff like 3.3 volt and 5 volt regulators, really difficult to find those parts. About 2 years ago, I asked him a question: how can we adapt the Vera for the Aquarius, just so we can get some sprites, just so we can get a bitmap mode, some tile maps? What can we do? And he goes, well, I've kind of wanted to start this little side project. I like the 6502 environment, but I'm kind of intrigued by this Z80 environment that the Aquarius has. And it also didn't have that funk that kind of the C64 has. The C64 has a massive community. There is something for everybody. Different, if you don't like the way this video handler does, you don't like this PCB, there's 1 million people working on the C64. There's maybe 200 people who even know about this system that are actively interested in it. So it sounded very interesting to him. He said, how can we turn this system into something that isn't reliant on chips that are getting harder and harder to find? How can we make it future-proof? And so we did. So it uses a USB keyboard port in the back. That solves the chunky keyboard. Now you can plug in whatever keyboard you want, and USB will take care of that. Also, forget RGB. We're just gonna send it out via VGA. It works pretty much the same throughout the world. And if you want HDMI, great, put a little $15 adapter on it. In fact, you can take the audio port and just plug it into those little $15 adapters. That's the way we do it. We do still have the legacy ports, the 2 DB9 ports, printer and cassette ports over here, although with the cassette port, we don't use that ridiculous DIN. We now have 2 traditional 1/8" audio in, audio out jacks for that. The printer port on the Aquarius is just an out. It's not bidirectional, it's just straight digital out. And of course, we've got this expansion bus, which is, it's unique to the Aquarius. What else do we got? So here's what the hardware looks like inside. We do have an ESP32. It is a Solo S3, so we take advantage of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Since our FPGA, a Spartan 6, has no memory in it, it's completely volatile. At boot up, the ESP32 sends our image to it via the SPI bus. We do have legit RAM. We do have a legit Z80 CPU, a couple of voltage handlers because this works primarily at the 3.3 volt level. We do have our controllers, as I said, and this is our storage. So the ESP32 handles the USB, and it handles the interaction with Wi-Fi, of course, and Bluetooth, and the SD card. Everything else gets pumped through the FPGA. This hardware has been working for about a year. It wasn't until recently, until parts became available, that we could crank these out. And in fact, I have an order of 50 of them, hopefully getting shipped out next week. Simple stuff like we put, this is a pin header that is pretty difficult to find. I mean, it's not difficult in the scheme of things, but this is not something that our manufacturer typically stocks. It's got a 0.01 inch difference between the pins. The original Aquarius had double that. It was 0.2 or about 5.04 millimeters. So we can do both of them, but this throws them for a loop. They're like, okay, does this cartridge port go here or here? So we actually had to put silk screen that says move it all the way to the right. Because if you put it to the back, all of these back sets of pins are tied together. So you could short it out if you put in the wrong cartridge. Since these controllers are tied directly to the FPGA, whatever you did with the core will control those however you want, and all of the pins, not just the data pins, but also the ground is. So if you've got something like an Atari where the ground pin is a little bit different than it is on the Aquarius controllers, you could almost plug in anything that's DB9 based into the Aquarius and use it as an input device as long as you had the appropriate driver. And again, we've got really good tool paths. We've got an SDK for SDCC for development. We've got a path for Z80 assembly development if you want to. And we're heading towards, Curtis is working on an S3 version of the ROM. We're heading towards what kind of feels like an AQOS, which might be a kernel-based system. Right now, if you boot up an Aquarius Plus, it's going to give you that traditional flashing screen that the Aquarius does. But it works. Here's with an Asterisk mask cartridge. 250, not bad. But again, anybody who is enterprising could absolutely go in and create a new core for this unit. It's basically a mister. If you wanted to run a 2600, you could just load up a new core and it just works. If you wanted to turn it into a C64, you would have to have some sort of an adapter on the bus to kind of flip the pins so there would be like a user port. You could do that as well too. So not only is it an Aquarius system, it can kind of be whatever you want to. We're also trying to find a way to miniaturize it. Let me see if I've got. So here's the actual Aquarius itself. We're trying to get a smaller version of it, which of course has no expansion ports on it, because a lot of people just want to load their ROMs. So this is the next thing that we'll do in development. And let's see, what else we got? All right, so here's my conclusion, finally. So here are my exhortations to everybody who is either watching this on the video or who's in the room today. My original goals were for you to try out the Aquarius or the Aquarius Plus. There are free emulators. If you want to do something cool on the Aquarius without having to worry about whether you've not got the hardware going, you can just load up an emulator, join an Aquarius community. I know not everybody is into Facebook, but we do have a pretty thriving community. There are other forums out there. Atari Age has theirs. Or just talk to somebody. Just talk to somebody at the fair today about the Aquarius. Here's some of the links where you can accomplish those goals. And here's where I pulled a lot of those videos from, or a lot of the images from. Here's how you can get in contact with me if you want. For the Aquarius Plus, this is probably a better link than this one is. We just got this domain and it doesn't quite want to redirect properly. So this is probably the best link. Again, if you want to build your own, the Gerbers are free. All the image files are free. We have a maker space on the site, so it'll walk you through the process. We use JLC PCB. I love PCBWay, but they make it a little bit harder to do the soldering for us. So we can get a board landed for $80, $90, depending on how quickly you want the parts, but it's pretty neat. So any questions? And go ahead.
Yeah, anybody want to have any questions? Just let either me or him know so we can come to you so we can record the question.
Yeah, so wait for the microphone so that we can have it on the tape.
Could I start with a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Has anyone ever told you that you look like Seth MacFarlane?
No, but thank you. I love Seth MacFarlane. He's a genius. I get Dan Aykroyd a lot.
The picture, even the pose, makes you look like him, yes.
That makes sense.
And another one is, how long did it take you to figure out the time period of each of the systems that you used over the years? How did you figure it out?
I'm meticulous. I just know. I kind of associate it partially from when my kids were born because I knew I couldn't afford a new system because we were paying for diapers and stuff. But I do remember kind of that point at which I said, no more Mac. I can't do the Mac anymore. And that was very clearly in 1999 when everybody was excited that Steve Jobs was back. Again, love Steve Jobs. He's a genius. But it was pretty easy to kind of track those. So.
You mentioned how with the Commodore 64, there's a lot going on. Also true of some other platforms that were really popular back then. Can you talk about why you're focusing in on this computer that's not all that well remembered, it was not a big hit, and is it rewarding in a different way than if you were doing stuff for a very familiar machine? And also, how many Aquariuses are there out there?
Excellent question. So when I was working with Perifractic and we were doing those projects, it became really clear very quickly that the skill set that I had was going to be eclipsed by people who were much more talented. Good friend of mine, Sven, I can't remember his name, out of Germany. He does a lot of C64 test harnesses, those sorts of, Sven Peterson. I look up to him a lot. I've learned a lot from him, Jan Beta, certainly Adrian Black. I knew that I couldn't make a difference in that space. Again, I love the C64. But when I want to get my C64 fix, I can pull out Jerry's joystick and it works just great. With the Aquarius, there was that guilt. I threw away the system. I should have given it more of a chance. And I knew that there was a very tight group of people who loved the Aquarius. In the UK, they call it the wee blue key. Or I should say, Roy Templeman calls it the wee blue key. Nobody loves it. It's been written off. So anything you do looks more impressive. So maybe it's little fish, big pond. Did I miss anything else on that? Or?
I just wondered, if I want to buy an Aquarius, how easy is it to get one? Are they on eBay all the time?
They are on eBay all the time. Their prices, now that they're kind of coming into their own, are a little bit more inflated than they should. Remember when I first mentioned it in the early 2000s, you can get one for $70, the full system. Now they're going up a little bit in price because people think that they're worth something. And I guess they are. I love original hardware, but at the end of the day, it is a Barbie computer, so, yeah.
Yeah, there's a general trend towards prices going up for vintage computers, especially in the last few years, but it's over the last 10 years.
Absolutely.
People are recognizing that people like us want to buy them, so their prices are going up beyond what we feel are reasonable.
Absolutely, and again, you get the classic untested. The good news is any Aquarius hardware you get is probably going to be pretty good. It's only got 8 electrolytic caps in it, and they probably do need to be replaced after 40 years, but they still just work. 9 times out of 10, if you get the right cable for an Aquarius, you can plug it in, it just works right out of the box. So.
Hi, Sean.
Hey.
I just wanted to mention, well, I'm a fellow Aquarian, by the way.
Awesome.
I got about 5 years and 4 days on you. But the origins of the VCF actually are with the Aquarius, believe it or not.
Interesting.
Because I had an Aquarius, it was my first computer. I got it through a timeshare. I forced my parents to go to this timeshare, go through the 2-hour hard sell or whatever, and then I got my computer. And I had it for a year, and then I wanted to get an Apple II because all my cousins had Apple IIs. And so I sold my Atari 2600 and my complete Aquarius system to put it into the Apple II Plus that I bought. Well, pretty much as soon as that happened, I had my Apple II Plus, I was really happy, but I missed my Aquarius because I put so much time into it, and it was like a personal relationship that I had with it. And subsequently, as I got into computer collecting, I've heard that story a lot from people. I developed I didn't want to trash this because I had to spend so much time writing on it or whatever. So it was because of that I decided, well, I'm never going to get rid of my old computers when I upgrade. I'm always going to hold on to my old computers because I didn't want to experience that again. I felt guilty for giving away my friend. So as time went on and I began to hoard and acquire computers from other people or whatever, and then in the 1997 when I joined the Classic Computers mailing list, which is still around, and realized there's a whole bunch of other people around here that collect computers, why don't we have a meeting, a convention, and that's the origins of the VCF. But it was because of getting rid of my Aquarius when I did, and then feeling guilty about it, that I started hoarding computers, which then eventually led into the founding of the Vintage Computer Festival.
Very cool. And that's happened in a lot of communities as well, too. The Aquarius stuck around really strong, particularly in the Netherlands and Brussels. There was a very, very vibrant community in northeastern Europe for a long time. In fact, Frank van den Hoof is from there. And he's like, oh yeah, I remember when, these folks were doing that and I thought they were crazy. But any additional questions before I close out? Nope. Come up and talk to me about it. I'm not selling any here because that's not what this is about, but I encourage you to at least talk to somebody about the Aquarius. So.
All right, everyone give him a big hand.